fire on them or you fire on me.
The Battle of Alamance was the first example of armed resistance against the British in the American colonies. It is important to our Baptist history because Baptist patriots were heavily involved in the Regulator movement. Following the separate Baptist revival in the 1750s and later, came the beginning of what turned out to be the Revolutionary War here in America. Members of churches such as Jersey Settlement Baptist Church and Shubal Stern's Sandy Creek Baptist Church were heavily involved in the regulation movement. In the mid-1700s, England was trying to pay for the French and Indian War, which they had not long before fought, and they were in great debt, and so they tried raising capital by taxing the colonists over here in the Americas. Some of these taxes were recorded for us in the Sugar Act or the Stamp Act or the Townshend Act and many others that led to cries of taxation without representation because the colonists were not properly represented in Parliament over in England. And there were also issues with corruption in the colonial governments here in America. That combined with changes in the law which made it illegal to perform marriages if you were not part of the state church here in North Carolina resulted in many of the marriages that were performed by Baptists and other dissenters, made them null and void and created a great hardship on these people. The end result was the regulation movement. Initially, the regulators sought peaceful means to change the laws and change enforcement, but when that failed, they resorted to things like terrorism and just outright protests and disrupting court proceedings. Governor William Tryon of North Carolina sought to suppress this movement and put an end to it. He gathered a force of militia and came here to Alamance Creek to enforce his edicts. Men up to the age of 60 were required to serve as militia soldiers and officers, and refusing to do so is part of what the regulation movement was about. Governor Tryon raised a militia force to put a stop to this regulation movement and gathered here near Alamance Creek. They were on their way to meet up with a force under the command of H. Waddell that had been intercepted by Captain Benjamin Merrill. Merrill was a deacon in Jersey Settlement Baptist Church. You may know of that church because it was founded by John Gannot. John Gannot went on to become a chaplain to the Continental Army and the personal chaplain of George Washington. He is also believed to have baptized George Washington by immersion at some time after the Revolutionary War. Captain Benjamin Merrill, a regulator, was in charge of about 300 to 400 men when he encountered General Waddell's force on May 12th. The general himself fled to Salisbury with some of his force, whereas many of them were captured by Merrill. After defeating Waddell and his forces, Merrill and his forces continued on towards Alamance Creek to meet up with the Regulator encampment here. On May 16th, Merrill was still some distance away from the encampment when he heard the gunshots from the engagement going on. A messenger informed him that the entire event was over by the time he was going to reach that area, and the group disbanded and went back to their homes. The Battle of Alamance lasted about 2 hours, with Governor Tryon and his 1,000 men facing off against the Regulators with about 2,000 men. However, the governor's forces were much better trained and armed. The result was a resounding defeat for the Regulators. From this location, North Carolina militia, under the command of Governor William Tryon, engaged a large group of Regulators in open battle. The ensuing engagement involved 3,000 people, 8 cannons, and lasted nearly 2 hours, and left scores killed and wounded. This was the governor's position on the high ground where I'm standing, looking across to the high ground where the Regulators formed and behind which was their camp. Battle of Alamance Creek. The high ground to the left was held by Governor Tryon and his loyalist militia. Whereas the high ground to the right was held by the Regulators. Before the Battle of Alamance, these men had to choose between fulfilling their colonial militia obligation or siding with their fellow backcountry dissenters. Because many of them had as much military training as Trajan's forces, the determining factor in the 2-hour battle was the governor's firepower, which included 8 cannons. Where I'm standing is the high ground held by the Regulators, looking across to the visitors center where Governor Tryon and his loyalist militia would have been standing when the battle ensued. The governor had the superior firepower and probably more trained troops than the Regulators had, despite the fact that they had the advantage in numbers. The loyalists had about 1,000 troops on their side, and the Regulators had about 2,000. But Governor Tryon had cannon, and the Regulators did not. The Regulators were very poorly armed and not very well led, with few or no officers being present during this battle. The Battle of the Alamance, the first battle of the Revolutionary War, was fought in Orange County, North Carolina, May 16, 1771. The governor then signed an edict outlawing all of the leaders of the Regulator movement, and his forces passed through the countryside, destroying farms and anyone who expressed support for that position. Benjamin Merrill's farm and plantation were overrun by Loyalist forces, and he was arrested. Shortly after that, he was sentenced to death. Chief Justice Howard pronounced the following sentence: "That you, Benjamin Merrill, be carried to the place from whence you came, that you be drawn from thence to the place of execution, where you are to be hanged by the neck, that you be cut down while yet alive, that your bowels be taken out while you are yet alive, and burned before your face, that your head be cut off, and your body divided into 4 quarters. This is to be at His Majesty's disposal, and the Lord have mercy on your soul." That was called being drawn and quartered. There is no record of whether he was just hanged or the entire sentence was carried out, but either way he was executed for the crime of resisting Governor Tryon as part of the Regulator movement. Of 12 Regulators condemned at Hillsborough, the following 6 were executed by the British governor: James Pugh, Hobart Mater, Benjamin Merrill, Captain Messer, and 2 others whose names are now unknown. Our blood will be as good seed and good ground that will soon produce 100-fold. James Pugh, under the gallows at Hillsborough, North Carolina, June 19, 1771. In the days that followed, Loyalist militia drove out the residents of the surrounding area at the various Baptist churches that existed at the time, including Sandy Creek, Abbott's Creek, Shallow Fords, Deep Creek, Ballew's Creek, Hunting Creek, and Jersey Settlement. According to historian Morgan Edwards, about 1,500 families fled North Carolina due to this persecution that was going on. Baptist historian William Cathcart said that the events here at Alamance were an inspiration to the rest of the colonies that led eventually to the Revolutionary War. He stated that they had given them an example of resisting against tyranny. Many, if not most, of the individuals here in the Regulator movement were members of Baptist churches at that time. That's why Governor Tryon sought to drive out those Baptist churches following the battle. Such was Governor Tryon's disdain for the Baptist people that, according to historian George Pascal, Tryon once called the Baptists enemies to society and a scandal to common sense. These Regulators and their families were driven from their homes and farms after the battle. They crossed over into places like Tennessee, from which later they returned to fight the Battle of Kings Mountain as the Over the Mountain Men. But that is a story for another day. Please refer to my videos on Shubal Stearns and the Separate Baptist Revival at Sandy Creek Baptist Church. These videos create the background for which the Regulator movement actually came into existence. The Baptists played an important part in our history, and we need to remember their contribution to America.